Abuse thrives in systems that reward silence, and at Fort Bellamy, silence had long been standard issue. Drill Sergeant Marcus Graves saw recruit Jamal Carson as just another name in the ranks, a quiet, disciplined black man he could single out, humiliate, and break without consequence. Graves assumed submission. What he never suspected was that Carson wasn't a recruit at all, but an undercover staff sergeant sent by the Pentagon to expose racial abuse inside the very institution Graves used as a weapon. By the time the truth surfaced, the entire command would be forced to answer for it. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The first rays of dawn broke hesitantly over Fort Bellamy, casting a pale, uncertain light across rows of immaculately maintained barracks and sprawling training fields. Set deep in the heart of rural southern Alabama, the base seemed untouched by time, a picture-perfect vision of military precision, tradition, and honor, at least from the outside. Within its gates, however, beneath the disciplined cadence and polished boots, whispered tensions and quiet resentments simmered just below the surface, hidden by uniforms and unspoken codes. Echoing voices shattered the morning stillness as recruits marched onto the training grounds, their footsteps perfectly synchronized, eyes forward, shoulders squared. At their front stood Drill Sergeant Marcus Graves, his broad shoulders squared proudly beneath a starched uniform that bore years of unchallenged authority. Graves was known to every recruit as the relentless gatekeeper of Fort Bellamy, strict, unyielding, and unforgiving. But to Jamal Carson, he was something else entirely. "Eyes front, recruits!" Graves barked sharply, his voice cutting clearly through the brisk morning air. He slowly paced before the line of young men standing rigid at attention, their nerves drawn taut beneath the surface of obedience. Graves paused deliberately in front of Jamal, his pale blue eyes narrowing subtly, studying him with barely concealed disdain. "Recruit Carson," Graves said quietly, each word weighted with contempt masked as authority. "Do you find something amusing this morning?" "No, Drill Sergeant," Jamal responded clearly, his tone neutral and respectful. His dark eyes met Graves' intense stare calmly, betraying neither fear nor defiance. Jamal knew precisely how this game was played and understood he must play along. For now. Graves stepped closer, almost nose to nose with Jamal. His voice dropped to a whisper, inaudible to anyone else, but sharp enough to cut. "We'll see how long that composure lasts. Men like you rarely finish what they start here." The statement hung between them, filled with implication and prejudice, before Graves abruptly stepped back, his voice booming once again. "Everyone down! Push-ups! Until I get tired." The recruits immediately dropped to the ground, the damp grass chilling their palms. Jamal moved smoothly into position, his powerful frame disciplined and composed, arms pumping in perfect rhythm despite Graves's relentless gaze locked firmly onto him. "Carson, I said chest down," Graves shouted, stepping deliberately closer. "Maybe you think you're special? Maybe you're used to shortcuts?" Jamal pushed lower, his chest barely brushing the dirt as he continued without protest, ignoring the sudden burn in his muscles. The tension around him thickened, other recruits glancing sideways, noticing the particular intensity Graves reserved solely for Jamal. "Eyes forward!" Graves snapped at them, but his attention stayed laser-focused on Jamal. "We're a team, gentlemen. No room for hotshots, no room for entitlement." As morning turned to afternoon, the harassment continued. Subtle at first, escalating slowly yet unmistakably. Whether it was a minor critique of Jamal's uniform, an unfounded accusation of tardiness, or a harsh criticism of his drill performance, Graves consistently found fault where none existed, always just plausible enough to maintain deniability. Jamal endured every barb without reaction, mentally cataloging every instance, every insult, and every subtle jab that Graves carefully disguised as discipline. At lunch, Jamal sat quietly, eating mechanically, observant as always. He watched carefully as Private Lucas Harris glanced toward him with hesitant curiosity. Jamal could see conflict etched on Harris's young face, caught between obedience to authority and something deeper, uncertain, yet clearly troubled by what he witnessed. From the corner, Graves silently monitored them, the disdainful tilt of his jaw growing tighter as he watched recruits gravitating naturally toward Jamal's calm steadiness. This unintended respect irked Graves deeply, prompting another calculated step toward escalation. The afternoon sun beat mercilessly on the obstacle course, where Graves paced impatiently, his eyes once again locked on Jamal's every move. Recruits scaled walls, crawled beneath barbed wire, and swung across muddy pits. Jamal performed each task with precision and grace that belied his rank as a recruit, drawing reluctant admiration from his peers. "Carson, again!" Graves shouted suddenly as Jamal finished, pointing toward the beginning. "Apparently, perfection is beyond your grasp." Without hesitation, Jamal returned to the start, his expression unchanged even as sweat soaked through his uniform. Graves moved closer, lowering his voice just enough for Jamal to hear. "I'll break you," Graves whispered coldly, his voice brimming with suppressed anger. "Your kind doesn't belong here." Jamal paused for just an instant, looking Graves directly in the eye, his voice steady, quietly resolute. "I understand clearly, drill sergeant." Graves stepped back, briefly unsettled by Jamal's quiet resilience. For the first time, uncertainty flickered briefly across Graves's expression before disappearing beneath practiced arrogance. Evening shadows stretched long and thin across the base when Jamal finally returned to the barracks, muscles aching deeply, but mind sharp and focused. As he meticulously cleaned his gear, he quietly observed his fellow recruits. They spoke softly, casting wary glances in his direction. Some appeared sympathetic, others carried quiet suspicion. Jamal knew what he was facing. The isolated recruit, targeted not just by authority, but subtly alienated from peers. It was an old tactic, well-worn, but dangerously effective. He also understood the necessity of patience. He had faced worse before, and this was a battle that would require a careful, strategic response. Outside, beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, Graves stood silently, watching Jamal through the barracks window. In his hardened eyes, resentment and suspicion burned like slow embers, waiting for the slightest breath of opportunity to ignite. Fort Bellamy appeared quiet now. The day's harsh discipline surrendered to darkness, but Jamal knew better. Beneath that calm surface, the real fight had only just begun. The pale glow of dawn swept across Fort Bellamy once more, scattering the lingering chill of the southern night. Recruits filed quietly out of the barracks, their steps measured, routines already becoming familiar. Jamal Carson walked silently among them, observing carefully, mindful not to draw unnecessary attention to himself. Attention already plentiful, courtesy of Drill Sergeant Marcus Graves. As the platoon assembled for morning roll call, Jamal's trained gaze scanned his fellow recruits, taking in details they themselves likely overlooked. He noted the tense shoulders and restless glances of Private Lucas Harris, the youngest among them, his youthful confidence already eroded by Graves's manipulative charisma. Harris, slender and wiry, stood rigidly, his eyes darting anxiously from Graves to Jamal. Jamal could read the internal struggle playing openly on the young man's face, the conflict between blind obedience to authority and the budding realization that something darker was at play. "Private Harris!" Graves barked abruptly, stepping into the young man's personal space. Harris jolted visibly, startled by Graves's sudden approach. "Yes, drill sergeant?" Harris responded nervously, eyes fixed straight ahead. "Why is your uniform an absolute disgrace?" Graves growled, running his fingers roughly over Harris's collar, his voice filled with exaggerated disappointment. "Did you iron this with your eyes closed?" "No, drill sergeant," Harris stammered. "I ironed it exactly as instructed." Graves leaned in closer, voice dropping ominously. "Excuses, Harris? You think your failures reflect only on yourself? They reflect on the entire platoon. On me. On Fort Bellamy." Harris swallowed hard, clearly intimidated, but said nothing further, merely nodding meekly. 20 push-ups now," Graves ordered sharply. "Everyone else, watch him and think carefully about standards." Jamal watched silently, recognizing immediately the tactic Graves employed, humiliation wrapped in the cloak of discipline. Graves circled slowly, his calculating gaze drifting back toward Jamal, subtly reminding him who was truly being targeted. The platoon resumed drills soon after, marching rhythmically across the parade grounds beneath the steadily climbing sun. As the morning progressed, Graves's tactics grew increasingly nuanced but consistent. Minor criticisms, slight misdirections designed to break the cohesion of the group, all carefully disguised beneath a facade of rigorous discipline. Jamal moved with practiced ease, acutely aware of every gaze upon him, noting carefully how recruits shifted nervously whenever Graves focused his attention in Jamal's direction. He was already cataloging patterns, building a comprehensive mental record for what he knew would soon escalate beyond subtle harassment. At lunch, Jamal found himself seated quietly across from Private Harris, who picked absently at his meal, his eyes downcast. After a long silence, Harris glanced up, hesitant but curious. "You seem calm about all of this," Harris finally murmured softly, glancing around nervously. "Doesn't Graves bother you?" Jamal looked up, offering Harris a calm but measured response. "Every drill sergeant pushes hard. It's part of the training." Harris frowned slightly, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. "This feels different somehow, personal, especially toward you." Jamal didn't immediately respond, carefully considering his words. "Keep your head down, Harris. Focus on why you came here. Everything else is just noise." Before Harris could reply, Specialist Maya Torres appeared at their table, holding a clipboard. Torres, composed and efficient, had a habit of moving quietly through Fort Bellamy, unnoticed by most, but Jamal recognized her skillful observation from afar. She paused briefly, her voice neutral yet subtly informative. "Carson, you're scheduled for an extra session today," Torres announced evenly, glancing briefly toward Jamal with a faint hint of sympathy that he noted instantly. "Drill Sergeant Graves's orders." Jamal nodded calmly. "Understood, Specialist." She hesitated briefly, her eyes conveying a message her words could not, before swiftly moving away. Jamal watched her carefully. Torres was clearly cautious, but observant. He noted her subtle but deliberate attempt at kindness, understanding it might be useful later. The afternoon session found Jamal alone, standing before Graves on an isolated obstacle course hidden away from regular training areas where fewer eyes watched. Graves paced slowly, studying Jamal with open suspicion. "Carson," Graves began deliberately, "I've seen recruits like you before. Gifted, disciplined, seemingly perfect, yet always hiding something beneath the surface." Jamal remained silent, standing rigidly at attention. Graves moved closer, eyes narrowing as he continued quietly. "You're here to blend in, I understand. But I also know men like you. Men who hide weakness behind competence, who blame others when things go wrong." Jamal's expression remained neutral, but internally he was alert. noting Graves's careful choice of words. "Permission to speak, drill sergeant?" Graves smiled coldly, nodding slightly. "Speak, Carson." "With respect, I'm here to become a soldier," Jamal replied evenly. "Nothing more." Graves smirked faintly, clearly unconvinced. "We'll see about that." He stepped back, pointing toward the obstacle course. 3 laps. Full pace. Now. Jamal moved swiftly and efficiently, navigating obstacles effortlessly, fully aware Graves watched closely for any sign of weakness. Each lap completed seemed only to anger Graves further, a reaction Jamal knew was dangerous, yet necessary to expose deeper truths. When he finished, breathing measured and composed, Graves approached again, his voice now dangerously quiet. "You think this is a game? You think you can impress your way out of scrutiny?" "I'm here to follow orders, drill sergeant," Jamal calmly responded, unfazed. "That's my only goal." Graves stepped closer, whispering harshly, "We'll find your breaking point, Carson. They always break eventually." Jamal held Graves's stare without blinking. Knowing this was a direct challenge, he had no choice but to accept. "With respect, drill sergeant, I'm here until the end." Graves's lip curled slightly, frustration evident despite his carefully maintained control. "Dismissed, Carson." Jamal turned smartly, walking steadily away, feeling Graves's gaze burn into his back. As he departed, Jamal knew this careful, calculated game was far from over. Returning to the barracks, Jamal quietly observed his fellow recruits again. Harris isolated in thought, others tense and wary, sensing unseen divisions forming beneath Graves's manipulative authority. Specialist Torres stood in the distance, clipboard held tightly, subtly watching Jamal's return. Night fell quietly across Fort Bellamy, yet Jamal lay awake, carefully reviewing every subtle action Graves had taken. Patterns emerged clearly in his mind: manipulation masked by discipline, targeted humiliation disguised as training. He recognized the signs clearly. These were familiar symptoms of something darker at the core of Fort Bellamy. Tomorrow would surely bring more challenges, more targeted harassment. Jamal understood precisely the type of man Graves was: dangerous, influential, and deeply embedded in the fabric of this institution. And Jamal was ready to patiently dismantle the illusion piece by piece, quietly determined to reveal the truth hidden beneath the surface. For now, Jamal closed his eyes, the silence around him deceptive, yet strangely comforting. The slow escalation had begun, and he was more than ready to meet it. The days at Fort Bellamy unfolded with a relentless, predictable rhythm. Marching, training, conditioning. Yet beneath this routine facade, the tension quietly escalated. Drill Sergeant Graves had made Jamal Carson his personal project. And now that subtlety had ceased to satisfy him, his tactics became visibly harsher, more openly malicious. It began early one crisp morning during rifle drill. Recruits lined the firing range, their breath visible in the cold air, the scent of gunpowder hanging thickly. Jamal knelt in position, carefully aiming downrange, his posture perfect, focus sharp. Graves hovered close behind him, his presence a constant pressure, his voice low, venomous, just loud enough for Jamal alone. "Careful now, Carson," Graves murmured softly, his words laced with disdain. "Maybe you learned to shoot on street corners rather than proper ranges." Jamal steadied his breathing, his expression remaining neutral, refusing to acknowledge the provocation. Graves leaned closer, his voice even lower, bitter with quiet prejudice. "Or maybe you never learned at all," he whispered coldly. "Men like you are always pretending to know more than they do, faking your way through life. But the Army sees through that." Jamal squeezed the trigger, a controlled, perfect shot ringing out, landing precisely in the center of the target. Without looking back, he spoke quietly, measured and composed. "Shot complete, Drill Sergeant." Graves straightened abruptly, frustration flickering briefly across his face before he regained composure. "Lucky shot," he said louder, sneering openly for others to hear. "But luck doesn't last, Carson." Across the range, Private Lucas Harris watched closely, his brow furrowing with quiet unease. Harris admired Jamal's calm strength but felt trapped, painfully aware of the unjust treatment yet helpless to challenge it. Beside him, Specialist Maya Torres moved discreetly along the range, ostensibly overseeing equipment. But her observant eyes noted every word, every carefully veiled insult Graves delivered. Later, during physical training, the harassment intensified. Recruits lined up, preparing for obstacle navigation. Graves approached Jamal directly, singling him out publicly this time, eyes narrowed with hostility. "Recruit Carson, front and center!" Graves barked loudly, drawing immediate attention from the entire platoon. Jamal stepped forward without hesitation, meeting Graves's fierce gaze calmly. Graves circled him slowly, assessing him openly, deliberately emphasizing his scrutiny. "This recruit here," Graves declared, addressing the platoon, "has been demonstrating an attitude problem, a pattern of arrogance, thinking he's smarter than his superiors." A tense silence descended as recruits shifted uncomfortably, avoiding direct eye contact with Jamal. Harris's eyes flickered nervously between Jamal and Graves, visibly conflicted by what was unfolding. Graves stopped directly in front of Jamal, his voice cutting sharply through the air. "We're going to correct that right now. You're running the course twice, Carson. Full speed. The platoon will remain in plank position until you finish." Jamal acknowledged calmly. "Understood, Drill Sergeant," knowing exactly the tactic Graves was employing, to isolate and alienate him through collective punishment. As Jamal began the grueling course, recruits dropped quickly into position, arms shaking beneath them. Graves followed Jamal closely, critiquing loudly, mocking his movements openly. "Is that your best, Carson?" Graves taunted, voice echoing harshly across the field. "I've seen better hustle in basic high school football drills. Maybe you're not cut out for the real military. Maybe you're better suited for the playground." Torres observed quietly from a distance, carefully noting Graves's escalating hostility in a small notebook, subtly documenting every moment. She noticed Harris struggling beneath the strain of the plank, his eyes fixed guiltily on Jamal. Torres marked this carefully. Harris's discomfort was significant. Cracks in Graves's manipulation were beginning to show. By the time Jamal completed his second lap, sweat soaked his uniform, yet his breathing remained controlled, composed. Graves's jaw clenched tightly, clearly angered by Jamal's continued resilience. "You think you're proving something by holding it together?" Graves hissed, leaning in closely again, dropping his voice into a low, hate-filled whisper. "You're nothing, Carson. Just another pretender. Your kind always fails. Eventually." Jamal kept his eyes forward, voice calm yet firm. "I'm here to train, Drill Sergeant." Graves stepped back sharply, barking an order to the recruits, releasing them finally from their punishment. "On your feet." "Dismissed." As the platoon dispersed, Harris lingered momentarily, casting a hesitant glance toward Jamal. The young man appeared troubled, guilt etched plainly on his youthful face. Before he could speak, Graves's voice cut sharply through the quiet. "Harris, did you forget how to move? Maybe Carson's slowness is contagious." Graves sneered cruelly, causing Harris to hurry away in embarrassment. As evening approached, Jamal returned alone to the barracks. Carefully cleaning his equipment, he was joined quietly by Torres, her approach cautious, yet deliberate. She spoke softly, her tone professional, yet laced with subtle concern. "You handled yourself well today," Torres murmured discreetly, pretending to inspect paperwork nearby. Not many could. Jamal glanced briefly toward her, understanding immediately the quiet message she offered. "This isn't my first difficult situation," he answered calmly, carefully gauging her intentions. "I appreciate the support." Torres paused briefly, looking directly at him with cautious sincerity. "You're not alone. Others notice, even if they're not brave enough to admit it yet." She departed quickly, leaving Jamal thoughtfully observing her exit. Torres had revealed herself carefully, indirectly, but intentionally. Her involvement hinted at broader, deeper issues, exactly the kind of systemic problems Jamal was there to uncover. Late into the night, Harris sat quietly at the edge of his bunk, unable to sleep. His mind replayed Graves's relentless harassment toward Jamal. Harris was torn between loyalty to his superiors and his growing discomfort at the injustice he witnessed. His youthful idealism collided harshly with uncomfortable reality. Slowly, Harris began to realize that the authority he trusted was flawed, dangerously so. Meanwhile, Torres sat alone in a dimly lit office, carefully reviewing reports and personal notes she'd secretly compiled. Her sharp eyes detected undeniable patterns. Graves had a history of targeting recruits based on racial bias, subtly documented through years of scattered incidents. Now she had clear evidence, but she knew the danger involved in revealing it. As darkness enveloped Fort Bellamy, Jamal lay awake, silently planning his next moves. Graves' visible escalation had provided undeniable proof of abuse, now carefully observed by others. Jamal knew that exposing this truth required patience, resolve, and the courage of recruits like Harris and allies like Torres. The harassment had grown overt, the risks higher, but Jamal was calm, resolute. He knew exactly what was coming next. Graves would grow desperate, his actions more reckless. Jamal was prepared to weather the storm, carefully, methodically leading Graves toward inevitable exposure. The clock ticked quietly, marking the hours until morning, and Jamal finally allowed himself to rest. Tomorrow, he knew, would test him even more profoundly. Yet he was ready, focused, unwavering, and quietly determined to bring justice, no matter the cost. Moonlight spilled softly through the barracks windows, casting long, silent shadows that crept across the metal bunks and polished floors like slow-moving ghosts. Most of the recruits had drifted into a restless sleep, their bodies exhausted by the day's trials. But Jamal Carson remained still and awake, his eyes closed only in appearance, his body calm on the outside but fully alert beneath the surface. He had felt it building steadily for days, the shift in tension when he entered a room, the calculated glances passed between certain recruits, and the hollow silences that followed him down hallways. Most of all, he recognized the quiet retreat in Graves's manner, the way the drill sergeant's bark had dulled into something colder, more deliberate, the kind of stillness that came not from retreat, but from planning. The creak of the barracks door, though barely audible, cut through the stillness like a blade. It opened slowly, carefully, and the shuffling of feet followed, a staggered rhythm, soft enough to mask intent, but just loud enough to confirm it. Jamal remained motionless as the figures stepped inside, but his senses sharpened. He didn't need to look to know who they were. He had already memorized their postures, their movements, and the way they gathered too closely in the past 2 days under the guise of camaraderie. Kincaid led them, broad-shouldered and breathing heavily, a poorly disguised mixture of fear and aggression tightening every line in his face. Behind him moved Raleigh, Durant, Connors, and Bishop, each one marked by uncertainty, painted over with forced conviction. They spread out slowly, surrounding Jamal's bunk in a semicircle meant to feel suffocating. None of them spoke immediately, and for a moment the only sound was the shallow breathing of 5 men convincing themselves they were right. Near the far corner of the room, Lucas Harris sat upright in his bunk, his back against the wall, eyes wide and locked on the scene unfolding before him. His knuckles were white as they gripped the frame of the bed, and though he didn't move, everything in his face, his tension, his silence, the slight tremor in his jaw, betrayed the weight of the guilt he was struggling to carry. Jamal opened his eyes slowly, rising to a seated position without alarm or confusion, and looked directly at Kincaid. The tall recruit shifted, surprised by Jamal's composure, but didn't step back. Jamal's voice was low, steady, and unafraid. "So this is how we're doing it," he said, scanning the faces of the others without flinching. 5 on 1. What lesson is this supposed to teach?" Kincaid swallowed hard, his fists clenched at his sides, before finally speaking through clenched teeth. "This isn't personal, Carson. You think you're better than us? You don't belong here, and we're tired of watching you act like you do." Jamal stood in one slow, deliberate motion, his eyes never leaving Kincaid. He stepped forward once, putting himself fully into the space they had formed, and squared his shoulders with calm precision. "You could have earned your respect," he said quietly. "Instead, you're trying to take it the cheap way." Whatever hesitation lingered in their eyes vanished as if on cue. Kincaid moved first, throwing a wide right hook, hoping power would land where skill could not. Jamal slipped the punch easily, rotated his body, and countered with a sharp elbow that caught Kincaid's ribs cleanly. The impact sent the tall recruit staggering backward, his breath catching audibly in his chest. Before Jamal could reset his stance, the others swarmed. Bishop and Connors grabbed him from behind, Durant closing in with a clenched fist aimed at Jamal's midsection. The blow landed hard, a sharp explosion of pain in his ribs that stole his breath and dropped his guard momentarily. Raleigh swung next, striking Jamal across the jaw with a closed fist that snapped his head sideways and split the skin just below his eye. For a brief second, the room blurred around him, his body rocked by the momentum of layered impact. Still, he didn't fall. Jamal twisted sharply, using his entire frame to throw Bishop off his back, pivoting as he dropped to one knee and catching Connor's ankle mid-step. In one fluid motion, he yanked the recruit off balance and drove his shoulder into Connor's gut, flipping him over and slamming him hard into the floor. Jamal rose quickly, but not quickly enough. Durant was already there, swinging again. This time the punch connected with the side of Jamal's torso, hitting the same bruised spot as before. He stumbled, pain blooming down his side like fire. Kincaid came back with fury, charging full speed and tackling Jamal into the frame of a bunk. The steel rattled violently under the force of the impact, and for a split second, Jamal saw stars. Kincaid grabbed his collar with both hands, slamming him against the metal again, and drew back a fist. But Jamal snapped his head forward, head-butting Kincaid directly across the bridge of the nose. Kincaid reeled back with a cry, blood already flowing. Raleigh returned, swinging with both hands. Jamal ducked the first strike, blocked the second with his forearm, and drove a precise punch into Raleigh's throat, just firm enough to drop him gasping to his knees. Before he could recover, Connors was up again, grabbing Jamal from behind in a bear hug. Jamal's ribs screamed as Connors lifted, trying to slam him back down. But Jamal bent forward, shifting his weight, and executed a backward throw that sent Connors sprawling. The fight was not clean. It was messy, brutal, close. Jamal was bleeding from his brow, his breath ragged, the muscles along his side tightening with every movement. His jaw throbbed from the earlier hit, and pain radiated through his chest every time he twisted. But even injured, even outnumbered, Jamal moved with a cold, measured efficiency that came from something none of these recruits had. A lifetime of training forged under real threat, not imagined grievance. Across the room, Harris had not moved. He was still seated, eyes wide, his face pale. His hands were clenched into fists in his lap now, but not out of readiness, out of helplessness. He watched each blow land, each takedown unfold, and with every passing second, the sickness in his chest deepened. He had allowed this to happen. He had known about it. He had said nothing. Jamal, despite the pain, remained upright. He adjusted his stance slowly, blood trickling from his lip, and prepared for the next wave. Kincaid, still reeling from the blow to his face, pointed at Jamal with a snarl. "Take him down!" he snapped, his voice cracking as fear bled into the edges of his rage. Durant, clutching one side of his jaw, stepped forward again, and Raleigh struggled upright, shoulders heaving. The air in the barracks had thickened into something suffocating, a silence straining beneath the ragged breath of injured bodies, and the dull throb of blood pulsing through open wounds. Jamal stood at the center of the wreckage, shoulders rising and falling with deliberate control, his uniform clinging to his back with sweat and blood. The skin above his left eye was split wide open, blood trailing down his cheek in a slow, steady line. One side of his ribs ached with every breath, a deep bruise already forming beneath the surface, but he kept his posture upright, his stance grounded, because he knew the fight wasn't finished. Not yet. Kincaid hadn't learned his lesson. He wiped the blood from beneath his nose, shook the dizziness from his head, and stepped forward again, his pride wounded more than his body. Durant, still favoring his jaw, closed in on Jamal's left flank, while Raleigh, wheezing from the throat strike, forced himself upright, eyes burning with humiliation. Connors had stayed down, coughing into the crook of his elbow, and Bishop leaned against a bunk frame, barely able to stand, but the remaining three were regrouping, circling like animals too hurt to back down, but too proud to retreat. "You think you're better than us?" Kincaid spat, his voice hoarse, teeth red with blood. "You walk around like you're some kind of damn hero." Jamal turned slowly, keeping them all in his periphery, his tone cold and precise. "You were given the same training. You chose to turn it into this. You don't belong here," Raleigh snapped, voice raspy but loud enough to echo off the steel walls. "This is our army. You're just a quota." The words weren't new, but they carried something heavier now, something meant to wound beyond fists. Jamal didn't flinch. He'd heard worse in quieter rooms from people who smiled as they said it. Still, he felt the heat surge in his chest. Not from anger, but clarity. "No," he replied steadily. "This isn't your army. Not anymore." Durant came in first, trying to catch him from behind with a bear clinch to immobilize his arms, but Jamal stepped forward instead, throwing his elbow backward into Durant's chin. The strike lifted Durant slightly off the ground, and as he staggered, Jamal pivoted, stepped inside the arc of Kincaid's swing, and launched a forearm into his collarbone, jarring the bigger man's upper body. Kincaid responded with a vicious uppercut that connected hard beneath Jamal's chin, snapping his head backward. Stars burst across his vision, and he stumbled, momentarily dazed. Raleigh took advantage, lunging with a wild punch that grazed Jamal's temple, forcing him against the edge of a bunk. The metal bit into his back. Kincaid tried to follow up with a punch to the ribs, but Jamal ducked low, grabbing the frame behind him with one hand and using it as leverage to launch a brutal counterkick to Kincaid's kneecap. The taller man dropped with a grunt, clutching his leg. Raleigh grabbed at Jamal's shirt, yanking him forward, but Jamal twisted out of it, driving his forehead into Raleigh's face. The crunch of cartilage was unmistakable. Raleigh's body recoiled instinctively, arms flying up to shield the blood pouring from his broken nose. Jamal didn't give him a chance to recover. He followed up with a precise two-strike combination, a jab to the throat and a hooking punch to the side of the neck that sent Raleigh crashing into the lockers, where he slumped and didn't get back up. Durant had recovered, and this time he came with desperation, swinging a small metal flashlight like a weapon. Jamal ducked beneath the first strike and rolled across the floor, coming up behind Durant, where he grabbed his arm mid-swing, twisted it violently backward, and drove his knee into Durant's spine. The makeshift weapon fell with a clatter, and Durant dropped to his knees, gasping in agony. Jamal kicked the flashlight across the room and stood over him, his breathing heavy but measured. Kincaid, furious and breathless, was back on his feet, limping but undeterred. His lip was split, his jaw swollen, one eye already beginning to close. He charged again, reckless, shouting through clenched teeth, "I'm gonna break you, boy!" The word echoed louder than the others. It wasn't the first time Jamal had heard it, but tonight, in this place, after all that had unfolded, it came with finality. Jamal met the charge full on. He didn't block this time. He absorbed the hit, letting Kincaid slam into him. The impact rocked them both, but Jamal anchored his legs, wrapped his arms around Kincaid's torso, and twisted with a clean hip throw that sent Kincaid crashing down onto the floorboards. Before he could rise, Jamal dropped low, pinned one arm under his knee, and struck him clean across the face. Once, twice, 3 times, until the rage in Kincaid's eyes blurred into dazed confusion. Kincaid mumbled something incoherent, blood trailing from both sides of his mouth, his fists unclenching as his body sagged beneath the weight of defeat. Jamal didn't speak. He rose slowly, staggering slightly, then turned in a slow circle to assess the damage. Connors was crawling for the exit, too battered to stand. Bishop lay motionless beside his bunk, arms covering his head. Durant was crumpled on the ground near the lockers, wheezing shallow breaths. Raleigh hadn't moved since crashing against the steel. Kincaid was conscious, barely, but his will had been shattered. Near the edge of the room, Harris remained standing, his face pale, jaw tight, still frozen. His eyes met Jamal's for the first time, and though the younger man said nothing, the shame burned in his expression. He had watched the entire thing, done nothing, said nothing, and now stood in the silence that followed, wrestling with what that meant. From the far end of the corridor, just beyond the door, Specialist Torres had returned. She stood partially in the shadows, unmoving, her notebook forgotten in her hand, her face unreadable. She had arrived in time to witness the second half, and what she saw was not chaos, not a loss of control, but a brutal, disciplined dismantling, one that revealed just how much Jamal had held back until now. The barracks were silent. Nothing moved, and though every inch of Jamal's body ached, his ribs bruised, his face bloodied, his limbs worn down from absorbing more than any man should, he remained standing. The next morning arrived with deceptive stillness, the kind that settled over Fort Bellamy like a sheet pulled tight, hiding the bruises beneath. The sun had only just begun to stretch over the eastern ridge, casting long, dusty beams across the training fields, yet already the platoon stood assembled at parade rest, lined up with boots firm in the dirt and faces blank with fatigue. Their uniforms were pressed, their stances correct, but something was off, something deeper than the muscle aches and sleep deprivation that usually clung to recruits like a second skin. The air itself felt tense, uncertain, as if the very soil beneath them had borne witness to the night before and now waited for the consequences. Drill Sergeant Marcus Graves stood at the front of the formation, his presence as large and commanding as ever, yet the usual sharpness in his posture had been replaced with something almost cavalier. He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back, pausing every so often to look down the line of tired, bruised recruits. His gaze lingered just a beat longer when he reached Jamal, but not with suspicion. No. What played across his face now was amusement. Something smug, something rehearsed. "Well, well," Graves finally said, stopping in front of Jamal, his voice carrying with casual mockery. "You really put on a show last night. I heard you dropped 5 men like bowling pins." Jamal remained still, eyes forward, face unreadable. Graves smirked and continued, walking down the line again. "You should have seen the looks on their faces. It's almost like they didn't expect a recruit to fight back. But see, that's the problem, Carson. You've got potential, sure, but you don't know your place." He circled back, standing directly in front of Jamal now, his voice dropping to something quieter, more pointed. "And if you think that little stunt is going to earn you stripes around here, think again. This place doesn't need lone wolves. It needs soldiers who follow the chain of command." Still, Jamal didn't flinch. Graves straightened, speaking louder now so the whole platoon could hear. "Recruits who don't understand the system don't stay long. I've seen it before. And trust me, I can wash you out just as fast as you showed up." He turned and marched off with the same practiced authority that had kept fear wrapped around this place for years. The platoon remained standing, silent, yet the weight of his words hung in the air like smoke. As they were dismissed, the recruits dispersed toward the mess hall in small, broken clusters. Most avoided Jamal's gaze. A few glanced at him with silent acknowledgement, something new that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not admiration. Something more complicated. Something closer to respect. Lucas Harris lingered near the rear of the group, walking slower than the rest. When he finally reached Jamal's side, he didn't speak at first. He kept his hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground, but his steps matched Jamal's as they made their way toward the building. "I'm sorry," Harris said quietly, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it was going to get like that. I thought it was just talk. I thought—" Jamal stopped walking and looked over at him. The swelling in his face had gone down slightly overnight, but the mark above his brow remained, as did the fading purple around his jaw. Still, his voice carried no hostility. "You didn't stop it," Jamal said, not as an accusation, but as fact. "You saw it happening. You knew what he was doing to me." Harris nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did." There was a pause between them. Recruits passed by, their chatter low and distracted. Jamal didn't wait for Harris to explain his inaction further. He simply said, "Then figure out what kind of soldier you want to be." He left Harris standing alone, quiet and troubled, the question burning deeper than any punishment Graves could have delivered. Jamal didn't go to the mess hall. Instead, he turned away from the path and headed across the grounds toward the administrative offices. His uniform was clean, his stride even, his face unreadable, but inside his chest beat the calm, certain rhythm of a man who had endured enough. The threat was clear now. Graves had no intention of backing down, and Jamal had reached the end of tolerance. The hallway in the admin building was quiet, as it always was during mealtime. Jamal walked past closed doors, polished floors, and faded posters about honor, respect, and service, each one feeling more like irony than truth. He reached the office at the end of the hall, where the nameplate still gleamed from polish. Drill Sergeant Marcus Graves. He didn't knock. He opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind him with a soft but deliberate click. Graves looked up from his desk, mid-sip of coffee, and blinked as if not quite registering what he was seeing. "I didn't call you in here," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're not dismissed to wander." Jamal walked to the center of the room and stood there, silent for a long moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his uniform and retrieved a small black document wallet. Without speaking, He placed it carefully on the desk. Graves glanced at it, then at Jamal. His eyes narrowed. He opened the wallet. The moment he saw the insignia, the color drained from his face. United States Army Criminal Investigation Command Special Assignment. Pentagon Oversight Division. Rank, Staff Sergeant. Name, Jamal R. Carson Graves didn't speak. The bravado evaporated almost immediately, leaving behind something hollow. His hands moved instinctively to close the wallet, as if seeing it less would change what it meant. "You've been under investigation since I arrived," Jamal said calmly, each word slow and deliberate. "Not just for misconduct, for systemic racial abuse, for physical coercion, for creating an environment where fear replaced leadership." Graves opened his mouth, but no words came. The lines around his eyes tightened as he searched for footing, but nothing in his usual arsenal, sarcasm, threats, deflection, could reach for him now. "You've manipulated recruits into violence. You've humiliated soldiers who trusted you with their training. You think you're too deep in the system to be touched." Jamal leaned forward slightly, his voice never rising, but gaining weight with each word. "But the system's looking back now." Graves exhaled slowly, as if the air had been knocked from him without a blow. "You set me up," he said finally, though the words came weakly. "No," Jamal replied. "You set yourself up. I just gave you space to prove it." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant call of a drill instructor outside. Graves sat frozen, eyes on the wallet. Jamal didn't offer further warning. He turned and walked toward the door. "You'll want to prepare your statement," he said without looking back. "Internal Affairs will be here by end of week." He opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind him. Graves remained seated, unmoving, the silence of his office deeper now than it had ever been. The air around Fort Bellamy shifted subtly in the days that followed Jamal's revelation. An invisible current moving beneath the surface, quiet and dangerous, like the hush before a breach. On the outside, the base appeared unchanged. Drills continued with military precision. Orders barked across sun-drenched fields, and recruits marched in time as if nothing unusual had occurred. But within the chain of command, behind closed doors and sealed folders, a storm had begun to gather, engineered not by justice, but by men afraid of its arrival. Graves did not confront Jamal again, not with words, not with eyes, not in public. But his silence was not surrender. It was calculation. The moment Jamal had walked out of his office, Graves had known his career was under threat, and he would not accept defeat without deploying the only weapon left to him, the bureaucracy itself. 2 days later, an official memo circulated through command channels, signed, sealed, and elevated to the attention of Fort Bellamy's Legal Oversight Division. In it, Graves accused recruit Jamal Carson of aggressive insubordination, physical intimidation of fellow soldiers, and a calculated effort to undermine the authority and discipline of the training structure. He painted the fight in the barracks as a violent outburst, an attempt by a rogue recruit to instigate division and fear. The document included carefully edited statements from the assaulted recruits, their language sanitized, their roles rewritten. Connors claimed Jamal had struck first. Raleigh described feeling cornered. Bishop's statement omitted Graves's presence entirely. Kincaid had said very little at all, his face still swollen, his confidence reduced to silence. But that silence had been filled in by Graves's narrative. By the end of the day, the memo reached the desk of Lieutenant Ava Reynolds, a recently promoted officer assigned to internal review. Young, ambitious, and by reputation efficient, Reynolds wore her uniform with immaculate precision and addressed every case with a brisk, no-nonsense tone that made her popular among senior officers. But beneath her polished demeanor was a need to preserve institutional stability above all else. And in her eyes, an undercover agent disrupting the chain of command threatened that balance far more than a problematic sergeant whose methods had produced results. She reviewed the complaint quickly, and within hours summoned Jamal to a closed-door interview. The room was small and windowless, the kind of space built to remind those inside of their place in the hierarchy. Reynolds sat across from Jamal, flanked by two administrative observers who said nothing and took notes without looking up. Her voice was even, almost too calm, as if the facts were already settled. "Staff sergeant or not," she began, folding her hands neatly on the table, "your investigation was not cleared through Fort Bellamy's direct oversight. Your presence on this base, as far as command is concerned, has already compromised multiple units." Jamal sat still, his hands resting on his knees, the swelling above his left eye still faintly visible beneath the skin. "My orders came directly from Pentagon CID," he answered. "The command at Fort Bellamy wasn't briefed because that's the nature of the assignment. I was instructed to observe, gather, and report without interference." Reynolds glanced briefly at the report on her clipboard. "Then perhaps your method of observation should have involved fewer fractured noses. 5 injured recruits, Staff Sergeant. Not one of them pressing charges, yet, but all of them pointing to you as the instigator." Jamal didn't raise his voice, but there was steel in the way he spoke. "They were ordered to attack me. That was the point. And their injuries weren't the result of aggression. They were the result of self-defense." Reynolds didn't flinch, but her expression hardened, her tone clipped. "Even if that were true, you failed to report it through proper channels. There's no witness statement, no official complaint, no medical documentation filed until after the fact." Jamal leaned slightly forward, not with aggression, but with clarity. "You'll find all the documentation in Specialist Torres's logbook. She's been observing graves for weeks, cataloging incidents, compiling patterns. She knows exactly what happened and why." Reynolds paused for the briefest moment, just long enough for Jamal to see something shift behind her eyes. Then she dismissed it. "I'll consider it," she said briskly, standing. "In the meantime, I've been advised to suspend your assignment pending further review. You'll remain on base, restricted from further investigation, and your conduct will be reassessed by command." The meeting ended without ceremony. Jamal was escorted out of the room, his expression unchanged, but his mind already running ahead. The system had moved quickly, too quickly. Graves hadn't just retaliated with lies. He had assistance. That suspicion was confirmed less than an hour later when Colonel Henry Gaines called Lieutenant Reynolds into his office. The colonel was a decorated officer with a silver eagle pinned to his uniform and a reputation built on order, loyalty, and absolute command control. He had served for 3 decades, rising through the ranks on the strength of discipline and politics, and now oversaw Fort Bellamy with a patriarch's eye, one that saw disruption as a disease, even if it came wearing official sanction. As Reynolds stood before his desk, Gaines didn't speak immediately. He stood by the window, arms crossed, watching a unit drill below with distant interest. "This Carson situation," he said eventually, his tone casual but firm. "We both know what it is. A test, a political move. Some desk jockey in D.C. trying to make a name for themselves by stirring up ghosts." Reynolds said nothing, just waited. "I don't like troublemakers in uniform," Gaines continued. "He's not wrong about Graves. Truth be told, I've had complaints over the years, but nothing that ever stuck. Nothing on paper. Graves produces soldiers. Carson? He's threatening to dismantle that." Reynolds shifted slightly, her voice cautious. "The evidence Torres collected may validate parts of his claims. If we suppress that too obviously..." "We're not suppressing anything," Gaines interrupted, turning finally to face her. "We're reviewing selectively. That's what this is. You don't need to discredit Carson. You just need to slow it down. We let this run through channels. We stall. We wait for CID to move on, and we make sure this base doesn't end up in the headlines." He stepped closer to his desk, voice now lower but unmistakably firm. "Do your job, Lieutenant. Protect the institution, not the hero." Reynolds gave a sharp nod and left the room, her clipboard pressed tight to her side. Outside, as the wind picked up across the open yards of Fort Bellamy, Jamal stood at the edge of the barracks, watching recruits run drills with the same precision they always had. But beneath the surface, he knew something had cracked open. Something that would not close quietly. He wasn't just fighting a man now. He was fighting the structure that had protected him. The wind across Fort Bellamy shifted again in the days that followed, not in gusts, but in steady, creeping drafts that whispered through the cracks of its foundation. The surface held, just as it always had, with drills on time, rifles cleaned to regulation shine, and recruits pressed into straight-backed silence under the southern sun. But within the administration buildings, within the barracks and break rooms and late-night murmurs between soldiers who once said nothing, something different had begun to move. It wasn't revolution, not yet, but it was memory, guilt, and unearthed truth beginning to take shape. Jamal kept his head down, officially sidelined, his assignment suspended by the same system he'd been sent to investigate. But restriction had never meant surrender. If anything, it gave him space to observe more carefully, to move more deliberately, and to find the cracks that had been waiting for someone to notice. He knew he needed voices, not just documents. Stories that had been hidden, buried under fear and career threats. The paperwork was one thing, but living memory? That was power. He found Sergeant First Class Roy Simmons just after sundown, seated alone behind the mess hall on a low stone step, with a half-drunk cup of coffee and a gaze fixed toward the empty lot. Simmons had been at Fort Bellamy longer than most of the officers commanding it. A solid, soft-spoken man in his 40s, with deep-set eyes and a posture that betrayed both discipline and weariness, Simmons wasn't loud, but his silence always carried weight. Jamal approached slowly, giving him time to register his presence. Simmons didn't turn at first, just took a slow sip from the cup and waited. "I need to ask you something," Jamal said quietly, taking a seat a few feet away, keeping his tone low and free of pressure. "Off record. Just between us." Simmons exhaled through his nose, eyes still on the distance. "Not sure if I have anything worth hearing." Jamal looked straight ahead as well, watching the last traces of sun fold behind the tree line. "You've been here a long time. You've seen how Graves operates. The things he says in private. The drills that go too far. The way he isolates certain recruits." Simmons was silent for a moment longer. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice gravelly with something deeper than exhaustion. "He's been like that since he made sergeant. Maybe before. No one ever stopped him because he never broke just enough rules at once." Jamal nodded. "You ever file a report?" "No," Simmons admitted. "I told myself I didn't see enough, that it wasn't my fight, that if I kept my head down, I'd stay clean." There was shame there, spoken like a man who knew the weight of that silence. "You ever see him put hands on someone?" Jamal asked. Simmons took another sip, longer this time. "Not directly, but I saw the aftermath. I saw a recruit, Private Mason, quiet kid, smart, always tried harder than the rest. He got reassigned to Graves's platoon late in cycle. 2 weeks later, he was gone. They said it was dehydration, no autopsy report, no inquiry." Jamal turned toward him now, his voice low but firm. "You think he died because of Graves?" Simmons didn't answer right away. He rubbed a hand over his face and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I think he was pushed too far. I think Graves knew exactly how to break him without leaving bruises where a camera could see. And I think someone told command to close the file before anyone could ask questions. Jamal let the silence settle between them, then said, "I need your statement. I need you to say it out loud, in front of the right people." Simmons shook his head slightly, not in refusal, but in the slow, painful way of someone dragging up years of regret. "If I do that, everything I let happen, everything I ignored, it's on the record." "That's the point," Jamal replied. "The system protects people like Graves, because men like you were left to carry the guilt alone. You speak up now. You don't erase it, but you finally put it somewhere it belongs." Simmons nodded slowly, the weight behind his eyes growing heavier. "I'll think about it." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a no, and that was the most Jamal had hoped for. Later that night, under the hum of flickering lights in the dim rear corridor of the admin wing, Specialist Maya Torres sat hunched at her desk, with her screen angled toward the wall. The clicks of her keyboard were quick, rhythmic, but careful, typed only when she was certain the hallway was empty. In her private folder labeled Personnel Archives, she opened a new document titled Mason D. Incident Record, Unexplained Discharge. She'd gone back through the base's personnel files under pretext of auditing injury reports. What she found had chilled her. 2 other names, both discharged under medical grounds within 6 weeks of reassignment to Graves's unit. One had been hospitalized for a stress-induced seizure. The other had reported recurrent respiratory failure from overexertion during unsupervised night drills. Drills that were never logged officially. And then there was Mason. No disciplinary issues, no medical history, no investigation into his death. Just a folded flag, a generic letter to the family, and a sudden burial under procedural paperwork. Torres stared at the screen, the cursor blinking beside a growing list of discrepancies. She added the last name and closed the file, encrypting it with a layered passcode before shutting down her terminal. She sat still for a long moment, staring at her reflection in the darkened monitor, then stood and disappeared down the hallway, like a shadow. Back in the barracks, Jamal returned late, his movements slow but steady. Harris was awake again, seated at the edge of his bunk, face lit faintly by the hallway light, bleeding through the open door. He didn't speak when Jamal passed, but his eyes followed him, no longer with uncertainty, but with the quiet resolve of someone preparing to make a choice. Jamal lay on his bunk, arms folded behind his head, the thin mattress doing little to ease the ache in his ribs. But as he stared at the ceiling, he felt it. Movement. Not fast, not loud, but present. The truth was beginning to wake up, and it was no longer only his burden to carry. Fort Bellamy woke each morning to the same mechanical precision. Boots on gravel before sunrise, drills echoing through the valley by 7. Rifles checked and rechecked under sharp-eyed sergeants whose authority rested on volume as much as doctrine. But for those who lived inside the belly of the base, something had changed. The silence between orders stretched longer. The glances over shoulders lingered. People had begun to wonder what exactly was being taught here and who was watching. In a restricted wing of the base archives, Specialist Maya Torres sat behind a locked door and a borrowed login she wasn't cleared to use. The monitor glowed softly against the gray wall, displaying 3 personnel files she had retrieved through quiet means, each one flagged for medical discharge, each with incident reports lacking timestamps, each tied to Drill Sergeant Marcus Graves. She had spent the night reading them over again, her eyes tracing the same patterns, the same omissions, missing sign-offs, contradictory injury statements, vague notations about field stress, hydration issues, mental instability. The most damning was the case of Private Daniel Mason, the recruit Sergeant Simmons had spoken of. Mason's death had been filed under dehydration-induced cardiac arrest. No inquiry, no autopsy, no family statement logged. But Torres had found the logbook Graves had carelessly signed the week before Mason's death. A series of unauthorized night drills were listed, times scrawled in a different pen, witness names omitted, all pointing to Mason being run harder and longer than regulation allowed. Torres sat back, eyes fixed on the screen, the implications settling around her like cold iron. It hadn't been an accident. It had been conditioning by abuse, framed as discipline. And someone had erased the evidence. She encrypted the files, uploaded the compiled report to a secure drive, and tucked the hard copy inside her jacket. She was running out of time. By midday, news spread across the base that Captain Elena Mitchell, a legal officer from the JAG Corps, had arrived from the Regional Command Center. Her presence alone caused a ripple of discomfort. She was sharp, direct, and carried the weight of federal oversight, an outside force no one at Fort Bellamy had requested. Mitchell was tall, composed, with a face unreadable behind clear-framed glasses and a voice that never needed to rise to silence a room. She didn't wear her authority loudly, but the air around her made clear she wasn't here for politics or protocol. She was here for facts. Colonel Gaines had met her on the tarmac with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Lieutenant Reynolds accompanied them during the walkthrough with tight-lipped professionalism, offering polite briefings that provided context without depth. But Mitchell had seen this before. She noted everything. Who talked too much? Who said too little? Who avoided eye contact when she asked where the files were kept? "Let me make one thing clear," Mitchell said to the assembled staff at the briefing that afternoon. "This isn't a witch hunt. This is a federal inquiry into procedural failures. If you've done your job with integrity, you'll have nothing to fear. If you haven't, now would be a good time to stop pretending you have." That night, under the quiet cloak of lights out, Private Lucas Harris sat on the edge of his bunk, legs bouncing with nervous energy, eyes flicking toward the hallway. The barracks had settled into the false calm of late evening, the sounds of snoring and page-turning lulling the room toward sleep. But Harris wasn't resting. He rose slowly, walked to the back entrance, and stepped out into the cool night air where Jamal was stationed under the overhang, his posture casual, his eyes scanning the shadows like always. Harris didn't speak at first. He stood near the doorway, hands tucked into his jacket, gaze low. "I saw what they did to Mason," he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not all of it, but enough." Jamal didn't turn, but he listened with sharp focus. Harris moved closer. "Graves told us Mason collapsed during PT, said he had a heart defect or something. But that's not what happened. He made him run the course 3 times. I was in the group. We weren't allowed to stop. Mason passed out. Graves told us to keep going." Jamal turned now, his expression unreadable in the dark. "You tell anyone?" Harris nodded, ashamed. "I told the platoon leader. He said he'd handle it quietly. A week later, Mason was gone. A month later, so was the report." Jamal looked him over, assessing not just the words, but the intent behind them. "Why now?" Harris hesitated. "Because I didn't stop what happened to him. And then I didn't stop what they tried to do to you. But I'm done being quiet." Jamal gave a single nod, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly. "Then I need you to speak up when it counts. Not just to me, to Captain Mitchell." Harris nodded quickly, jaw clenched, eyes filled with the conviction that only regret could build. "I will." They stood there in the silence for a moment, the cool air wrapping around them like a final breath, before everything changed. Inside the barracks, no one stirred, but Jamal felt something shift. He was no longer the only one gathering the truth. And Graves? He wasn't hiding behind silence anymore. He was standing in its crosshairs. By the time the week ended, Fort Bellamy no longer moved with its usual rhythm. The cadence of order still echoed across the fields. Rifles snapped to shoulders, boots struck gravel in formation. But beneath the surface, cracks widened into fault lines. Rumors traveled faster than orders now. Recruits whispered about files going missing, about a federal captain who didn't salute to anyone but listened to everything, and about one man, one recruit, who was no recruit at all. Captain Elena Mitchell worked without theatrics. She didn't confront or grandstand. She investigated, quietly, precisely, and with a tenacity that unnerved command. She requested access logs to disciplinary records, but found them partially redacted. She asked for Mason's medical file, only to discover it had been reassigned under a misfiled date and stored in a location not used for years. She spoke with officers and specialists, most polite, most evasive, and every conversation, every pause, every withheld file told her more than the words spoken aloud. Jamal walked beside her during those late evenings in the JAG field office, quietly reviewing findings, cross-referencing names, timing discrepancies, and empty folders that should have contained critical reports. He had once worked missions overseas where targets were buried under 6 layers of false identity. This was no different, except the enemy here wore the same uniform he did. The breakthrough came late on a Tuesday night, in a file Torres hadn't intended to find. She had been scanning backup logs, old server data copied routinely but rarely accessed, and stumbled across an archived folder marked Fitness Adjustments, Field Adaptation Protocol. The language was vague, bureaucratic, the kind designed to avoid inspection. But inside were dozens of case notes and injury records that should not have existed. Documents detailing off-hours training sessions, physical evaluations conducted without medical staff, and names. Daniel Mason's was there. So were 2 others, Private Darrell Woods, hospitalized for severe respiratory failure after extended conditioning, and Private Alan Knox, who fractured his femur during what was labeled an unsanctioned obstacle calibration. All were under Graves's training unit. None of the injuries were reported through proper channels. All were signed off by Colonel Henry Gaines. His signature was careful, buried beneath layers of jargon, but clear. Each approval, routed through private memos, bypassed medical review. They were processed as routine risk adjustments under an internal clause that no recruit would ever know to challenge. Torres printed the key documents and backed them onto a secure external drive, locking it in her drawer for the night. But when she returned to her desk the next morning, the drawer was unlocked, and the drive was gone. No one admitted to accessing her terminal. Security footage from the hallway had been corrupted. Her desktop had been wiped and re-imaged without request. When she questioned IT, they said it had been a maintenance error. No one looked her in the eye when they said it. That same afternoon, she received an official warning letter from Lieutenant Reynolds citing unauthorized data handling and potential compromise of administrative protocol. If she repeated the violation, she'd be reassigned. Quietly. Without appeal. She found Jamal just before lights out, waiting alone near the motor pool, his face hard with focus. "They found the drive," she said, voice tight, eyes darting over her shoulder. "And they wiped my logs. They know I'm helping you." Jamal nodded slowly, jaw clenched, the weight of her risk clear in his expression. "But they left the memo trail?" Torres pulled a small printout from her sleeve, the last physical copy of the memo Gaines had signed. An approval for an extended conditioning drill that matched the date of Mason's collapse. They didn't find everything. Not yet. Jamal folded the page carefully and tucked it inside his field notebook. That's enough. But even as he said it, he knew the noose had tightened. Whoever had ordered the wipe was watching them now. Graves had gone silent. Gaines hadn't spoken to Mitchell in 2 days. The base was still following orders, but the chain of command had turned to stone. Later that evening, Captain Mitchell stepped into her office to find a sealed folder left on her desk. No name, no return address. Inside were 2 pages, copies of the original discharge orders for Daniel Mason and Darrell Woods, both marked with red stamps, closed, no follow-up. No one admitted to leaving the file, but someone wanted her to see it. That night, Jamal returned to the barracks to find Harris sitting at his bunk, waiting. "I heard Torres got flagged," Harris said quietly. "They're closing in on you." Jamal didn't respond right away. He sat down, the bruises from the barracks fight still aching beneath his ribs, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I need one more voice," Jamal said. "Someone who's been here long enough to matter. Someone who saw the system rot and kept working inside it." Harris hesitated. "You mean Simmons?" Jamal nodded once. "He's the key." The next morning, Jamal found Sergeant First Class Roy Simmons in the weight shed behind the training fields, alone with the clatter of metal and the steady repetition of a man working to forget. Jamal waited until the set ended, then stepped forward and handed him the folded memo. Simmons read it in silence, the color draining slowly from his face. "This is what they buried," Jamal said. "And you knew it." Simmons didn't deny it. He just looked up, shoulders tight, and said, "They'll bury me next." "Then stand up before they do," Jamal replied. And this time, Simmons didn't say no. The heat in the training yard that afternoon was oppressive, heavy enough to bend breath and slow movement. But the drills went on with relentless consistency. Recruits shouted cadences under a sky that offered no relief, their boots thudding against the packed dirt in perfect rhythm. Yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. Word traveled faster than the drill calls, rumors that a federal case was underway, that documents had surfaced implicating someone higher than Graves, that Captain Mitchell wasn't just visiting. She was watching. Graves had remained distant for days, his anger masked by a veneer of professionalism that was cracking visibly by the hour. He still barked orders, still demanded form, but his voice carried differently now. Less authority, more edge. He no longer paced with the confidence of a man in control. Instead, he loomed, watching every movement like a man trying to calculate which cracks might become fractures. Jamal was running laps when Graves appeared on the edge of the field. He had been standing by the obstacle course, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching silently as recruits climbed, crawled, and sprinted. Then, without announcement, he stepped forward, cutting across the yard until he stood directly in Jamal's path. "Carson!" he barked. "Front and center!" Jamal slowed, his shirt soaked with sweat, the ache in his ribs flaring again, but he walked steadily toward Graves, without hesitation. The other recruits stopped gradually, their drills dissolving as they sensed something sharper in the air. A few officers nearby paused as well, pretending not to notice the confrontation forming in plain sight. Graves waited until Jamal stood in front of him, then stepped closer, too close, his voice low and tight with fury. "I don't know who you think you are," he hissed, "but you're not walking out of this clean. You made a mess, and I'm going to bury you in it." Jamal didn't flinch. "You already tried. Didn't work." Graves's lips curled, a flash of red blooming across his face. He jabbed a finger into Jamal's chest. "You think those papers mean anything? You think your little report scares me? I've been cleaning up this place since before you knew how to salute. You're not the first to come at me, And you won't be the last." Jamal's voice didn't rise, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "The difference is, I'm not coming at you alone." Graves's restraint finally snapped. He shoved Jamal backward hard, his palms slamming into Jamal's chest with enough force to stagger him a step off balance. The yard froze. The recruits standing nearby stiffened, hands halfway to salutes or stances, unsure whether to break formation or hold. No one moved. No one spoke. Jamal held his ground. He didn't reach for his weapon, didn't raise his fists. He stared directly at Graves, breathing hard but steady, watching as the drill sergeant took another step forward, teeth clenched, face flushed with pure, seething rage. And then a voice rang out behind them. "Stand down, Sergeant." It was low, calm, but it carried across the yard with more authority than shouting ever could. Graves turned. Sergeant First Class Roy Simmons was walking toward them from the edge of the formation. He moved with purpose, sleeves rolled, sweat gleaming on his arms, but his posture was upright, firm, unwavering. He passed by the frozen recruits without looking at them, his eyes locked on Graves. "You touch him again," Simmons said, stopping between them, "and I'll file charges myself." Graves looked stunned, not because he'd been challenged, but because it had come from Simmons, a man who had stood beside him through years of silence. His voice was shaky with disbelief. "You're seriously taking his side?" "I'm taking the side of the truth," Simmons replied, louder now, his voice carrying across the yard. "I've seen what you've done. What you've called discipline. What you've broken in the name of toughness. Not anymore." Jamal stood silently behind him, his chest rising and falling, blood still pounding in his ears. Simmons didn't look back at him, but the gesture, the shield he formed with his body, was louder than any declaration. Graves tried to speak, but the words caught. Recruits were watching now, all of them. The field was no longer silent, but filled with something heavier. Witness. Colonel Gaines stood at the far edge of the yard, arms folded, face unreadable. Captain Mitchell emerged seconds later, having arrived quietly, but in time to see enough. Her eyes moved from Graves to Simmons, then to Jamal, her expression calm, taking mental notes with every breath. Graves turned away finally, jaw locked, fists clenched. He walked off the field without a word, his retreat more damning than anything spoken aloud. Simmons exhaled slowly, then turned to Jamal. "If they come after you again," he said quietly, "they'll have to go through me first." Jamal nodded once. "Thank you, Sergeant." The other recruits didn't resume their drills. They stood in quiet clusters, watching the path where Graves had stormed off. Something had changed. The silence had broken, not with shouting, not with punches, but with a line that had finally been drawn in full view of everyone. The next move would come soon, and this time no one would pretend they hadn't seen it. The tribunal preparations moved quickly once Graves's public confrontation was reported, and command was no longer able to contain the unfolding investigation. A hearing room was assembled in the administrative annex, nothing elaborate, just long tables, stiff chairs, and a podium set beneath the seal of the U.S. Army. But every detail of the setup carried weight. Captain Mitchell presided with quiet efficiency, flanked by representatives from JAG and an external military oversight board flown in from regional command. The message was clear. Fort Bellamy was no longer left to police itself. Jamal spent those days reviewing statements, cross-checking timelines, and working with Mitchell to prepare the case. Testimonies from Simmons and Harris were being finalized, the chain of abuses from Graves catalogued with mounting clarity. For the first time, the evidence felt undeniable. Mason's death, the falsified discharge reports, the restructured files Torres had uncovered. Everything was aligning. But the deeper the truth pushed forward, the more resistance it stirred. It began with inconsistencies. A training log Torres had insisted she copied was now missing from the file room entirely. A memo Jamal had personally printed was no longer in his records folder. Torres herself had become harder to find. Her shifts restructured, her messages brief and clipped, her eyes evasive whenever Jamal tried to follow up on documentation they had previously reviewed together. Then Lieutenant Reynolds requested a private meeting. She found Jamal just outside the supply depot, her uniform immaculate, her tone low and guarded, as she waved him toward the concrete stairwell leading to the comms maintenance wing. It was quiet there, tucked between two buildings, shielded from passing traffic. Reynolds didn't lean against the wall or offer pleasantries. She went straight to the point. "I know I've made this harder for you," she said, "and I know you don't trust me." Jamal folded his arms across his chest, his voice even. "I've had reasons." "You still do," she said, eyes sharp. "But I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to tell you something you need to hear. Because if you walk into that tribunal without knowing what's happening behind your back, this entire case collapses." Jamal studied her. "Go on." Reynolds lowered her voice, every word precise. "There's sabotage happening inside your team. I've seen the access logs. Someone with high-level clearance has been editing your evidence trail, removing certain entries, replacing others with misdated copies, submitting altered versions of your memos to the prep files." Jamal's face remained still, but his chest tightened. "Who?" Reynolds looked away for the briefest moment before answering. "Torres." The name landed like a jolt. Jamal didn't speak, waiting for the follow-through that had to come. "I didn't want to believe it either," Reynolds continued, "but she's been pulling files under false pretext for weeks. Several of the documents she handed to you never matched the backups. I thought she was just being sloppy, until I found a cross request under her name. Authorized by Colonel Gaines. The pieces began snapping together, ugly and fast. Torres's sudden disappearances, her changes in demeanor, the missing files, the tightened chain of command. "She's being coerced," Reynolds said quietly, "and I know why." She pulled a folded paper from her jacket, an internal personnel form with a name circled. Private Elias Torres. Infantry. Bravo Company. Currently under pending review for unauthorized communications. No incident report, no complaint. Just an internal note from Gaines's office requesting restriction from base privileges. "She has a brother here," Reynolds said. "Gaines is threatening him. If she doesn't feed him updates, if she doesn't compromise your case, he'll make sure her brother is dishonorably discharged or worse." Jamal took the form silently, scanning the name, the vague description, the familiar tactics. It wasn't just about Graves anymore. Gaines was engineering from above, pulling strings to protect himself, using Torres as a lever because she'd been too close to the truth. "She didn't come to me," Jamal said after a long pause. "She could have said something." "She's terrified," Reynolds replied. "She's a junior specialist caught between her brother and a colonel who can end both of their careers. She probably told herself it would just be a file here or there. Just enough to keep him from pulling the trigger." Jamal nodded, the weight of betrayal sitting heavy in his chest. He had trusted Torres, not just with evidence, but with timing, with access, with truth. And yet, part of him understood. Not forgiveness, but understanding. "She hasn't burned everything," Reynolds added. "Some of what she gave you still holds up. But you need to confront her. Quietly. Now. Before Gaines pulls the last thread, and this all unravels." Jamal stood there in the shadow of the stairwell, jaw tight, the sound of cadence calls distant behind the building. He felt the familiar pressure of being flanked, not in combat, but in something more dangerous. Misinformation, misplaced trust, The subtle art of being undone from the inside. "Where is she?" he asked. "On the East Wing tonight," Reynolds said, filing logistics requests. "Alone." Jamal gave her a final nod. "Thanks." Reynolds turned to leave, pausing only once to glance back. "I don't know what you think of me, but I know what Gaines is, and I know you're the only one with enough left to stop him." Jamal didn't answer. He watched her go, then turned toward the path leading to the East Wing. The fight ahead was no longer about evidence. It was about the cost of truth, and who would be brave enough to pay it. The corridors of Fort Bellamy's East Wing were quiet by night, illuminated only by narrow strips of flickering fluorescent light that buzzed faintly overhead. Most of the offices had gone dark hours earlier, but at the far end of the administrative bay, one door remained open, its glow spilling across the tiled floor in a soft rectangle. Inside, Specialist Maya Torres sat alone at her desk, her jacket draped over the back of her chair, the sleeves of her uniform rolled to the elbows. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but her eyes weren't on the screen. When Jamal stepped into the doorway, she looked up with a start, caught in the act of second-guessing her own decisions. "You working late?" he said, his voice steady, but stripped of any accusation. "Or covering tracks?" She stood quickly, eyes wide, posture rigid. "You're not supposed to be here." "Neither are you," Jamal replied, taking a step inside and gently closing the door behind him. "But I think we both know this place stopped running by the rules a long time ago." Torres didn't respond. Her jaw tightened, and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I know about your brother," Jamal said softly. That made her freeze. "Private Elias Torres," he continued. "Gaines is holding him hostage, telling you to feed him pieces of my case, changing logs, letting files disappear. I don't blame you for protecting your family, but you have to know, it won't end with this." Torres swallowed hard, her breath trembling in her chest. "He said it would just be little things," she whispered. "Files that didn't matter. He said if I didn't do it, they'd throw Elias out with a charge that would follow him for life. My brother didn't do anything wrong. He just mouthed off once. They flagged him for insubordination and said they'd make it stick." Jamal nodded slowly, stepping closer, his voice calm, almost gentle. "You didn't ask for this, but they gave it to you anyway. They made you choose between silence and survival." Her hands clenched into fists. "I thought I could control it. I kept backups of the real files. I thought if it got too bad I'd come clean, but every time I hesitated, Gaines reminded me what they could do to him. And I didn't want to lose the last piece of my family over someone else's war." "It's not someone else's," Jamal said. "This system you're trying to protect him from. That's the same system that killed Mason. That turned Harris into a silent witness. That nearly broke Simmons. If we don't expose it now, someone else will end up dead. And this time, maybe it won't be a name on a memo. Maybe it'll be your brother." Her breath hitched. Jamal stepped in front of her, not as a soldier, not as a superior, but as someone who knew exactly how much the system could take from a person before they stopped feeling like they could fight back. "You already made one brave choice," he said. "You came to me once. Do it again. Not just for me. For him. For every recruit they put through this." Torres's eyes filled with tears. Her shoulders dropped, and for the first time in all the weeks Jamal had known her, she looked small, exhausted, broken by pressure no one had seen until now. "I have the full drive," she said, voice cracking. "I kept it in the ventilation duct above the storage lockers. Everything's on it. Original training logs, unedited discharge papers, scanned memos with Gaines's signature. Everything." She covered her face with one hand, wiping at her eyes with the other, her body shaking. Jamal didn't move to comfort her, didn't offer sympathy she hadn't earned, just the space to let go. and the presence of someone who would still stand beside her when it was done. 2 days later, Private Lucas Harris stood before the tribunal panel in a stiff, borrowed uniform, his hair freshly trimmed, his eyes shadowed by guilt, but filled with a resolve that had taken months to form. Captain Mitchell sat at the head of the long table. To her right were 2 oversight officers, to her left, a federal observer from CID headquarters. The gallery was full, recruits, staff, commanders, and a few who had tried to pretend nothing was happening until it became impossible to ignore. Harris's voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each sentence. "I saw what they did to Mason. I watched Graves push him past his limit, and when he collapsed, I was told to keep running. I saw Graves do the same to other recruits. And when I tried to speak up, I was told to shut up if I wanted to graduate. They made it clear, follow orders, or disappear like the ones before me." His words cut through the room like steel wire. There were no outbursts, no objections, just stillness. Then Sergeant First Class Roy Simmons took the stand. His voice was lower, slower, but no less certain. "I stayed silent because I thought speaking up would do more damage than good. But watching what they did to Carson, seeing it unfold again, just like with Mason, I couldn't sit on that anymore. Graves didn't train soldiers. He punished them. Gaines protected him because it kept numbers up and complaints down. One by one, the evidence Torres recovered was submitted. Copies of altered files, digital timestamps showing unauthorized edits, audio recordings from Gaines's private briefings, and a full report written under Reynolds's name. One, she later admitted, was dictated to her by command. By the time Captain Mitchell adjourned the day's session, the room no longer felt like a military base. It felt like a courtroom. And truth, long buried under protocol and fear, was finally speaking in full. The final tribunal verdict came without fanfare, delivered in the clear, formal cadence of a military panel, but its consequences echoed through every hallway and field of Fort Bellamy. Drill Sergeant Marcus Graves was dishonorably discharged, stripped of rank, privileges, and the legacy he had tried so hard to protect. His record, once a badge of pride, now bore the weight of a federal conviction for abuse of authority and falsifying reports. Colonel Henry Gaines, exposed as the architect of the cover-up, was escorted off the base in silence. His dishonorable discharge followed a scathing summary of his role in manipulating training protocols, coercing subordinates, and burying deaths he was sworn to prevent. There was no ceremony, no farewell, just an empty office and a nameplate removed from the wall before the sun had set. Lieutenant Ava Reynolds, though not spared, faced a different consequence. Demoted and reassigned, she left Fort Bellamy under quiet orders, her once rising career redirected by her willingness to bend to power rather than uphold truth. But as she passed Jamal in the courtyard on her final day, she paused just long enough to meet his eyes and offer a faint, solemn nod. Not apology, acknowledgement. Specialist Torres, whose courage had nearly cost her everything, was granted full immunity and commendation for her cooperation. Her brother's record was cleared, and she was transferred to a secure cyber ops unit, far from Gaines's reach. When she left, she handed Jamal the original flash drive wrapped in a folded paper towel. "Just in case," she said with a tired smile. Some ghosts deserve to be kept close. Private Harris, once paralyzed by guilt, stood taller now. Under Jamal's mentorship, he entered specialized reconnaissance training, showing a sharpened discipline forged not by fear, but by clarity of purpose. Jamal saw in him not just potential, but promise. The kind that would ripple outward long after Fort Bellamy was just another line in his service file. As for Sergeant First Class Roy Simmons, he retired 6 weeks after the tribunal. Honorably, quietly, and with the burden finally lifted from his shoulders. At his send-off, He approached Jamal with a handshake that turned into a firm clasp on the shoulder. "You did what I couldn't," he said, "and made it count." Jamal Carson remained at Fort Bellamy, not undercover now, but as a permanent assignment. His new role? Senior Ethics and Compliance Officer, overseeing reforms in training conduct, reporting systems, and instructor oversight. What was once hidden was now required to be seen, and Jamal would make sure of it. He stood alone that evening at the edge of the parade field, the wind tugging gently at the flag above him. Recruits marched in the distance, not with fear, but with direction. The system had bent, nearly broken, but not beyond repair. And under his watch, it wouldn't be allowed to break again. The silence was gone, and in its place stood truth. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.